Hi folks, Adam Andrews here from CenterForLit. I have a question for you. Is it necessary to understand the context of a great book in order to teach it effectively? Is it necessary to understand the context of a work of literature in order to understand it fully and appreciate its universal applicability to human life? It's an interesting debate that's popular among curriculum designers and teachers and people interested in pedagogical concerns. And it really has two sort of poles, this debate. On the one hand, some people say that context, which is the term we use for the details of the life and times of a work's author, the political and social and economic concerns that may have motivated him to write his work in the first place, all of the historical and chronological data that surrounds the composition of a work. Some people say that stuff is very, very important for understanding what a work is really trying to say. That the theme and the lesson and the moral and the artistic statement that a work of literature represents arise inevitably out of its historical and social and economic context. And that to understand the work, you must understand the context. On the other hand, some people say that a great work of literature stands quite apart from its historical grounding, from its socio-economic milieu, and that the thing that makes a great work of literature great is its universal application. And that as teachers, we ought to be concerned primarily with that universal application and communicating that to our students, who may or may not have anything in common historically and socioeconomically with the author in his life and times. And there really are two, as I say, two poles to this debate. I think it's important as teachers that we understand which one of those carries the more weight and which perspective on this debate we ought to take into our teaching. I think each perspective in this debate has some good points about it, but can be taken to an illogical or unhelpful extreme. On the one hand, those who say that the historical context, the social and economic and political context of a work is all important, run the risk of misinterpreting every work of art as a work of archaeology or a work of autobiography, or as arising necessarily out of its particular conditions, and thus being not really applicable to other conditions, to other times and places. To read a work of literature as a work of determinism, in a sense, as a work of autobiography determined by the previous history of the author, is to deny its power to speak across the ages. On the other hand, to read a work of literature as completely separate from its time and place is to rob it of its power to speak maybe just as profoundly. I think the best way to look at a work of literature, with respect to context that is, lies somewhere between these two extremes. And this is the way that I would recommend that teachers and indeed readers approach a work of literature that comes from a particular time and place. That they do a reading or an interpretation of the work based on the internal evidence of the work itself, based on a structural analysis of the work as an art form, and then apply some details of historical and social and economic and religious and philosophical context to their interpretive work at the end by way of verifying their conclusions to see if they actually are borne out by historical realities. Let's take a work by Ernest Hemingway, for example. How about the Old Man and the Sea, the 1953 novella that won him the Nobel Prize, that is partakes of universal themes and is well regarded as one of the great works of fiction of the 20th century. What does it speak to us of? If we were to do a structural analysis of the Old Man and the Sea and ask questions like the goals and obstacles facing the protagonist and the organization of plot elements that drive that essential conflict to a climactic moment and move it on toward a resolution. In other words, ask the kind of questions of the work that could be asked of any work from any time and place, and treat the work as a timeless, eternal work of art. What sort of conclusions, what sort of themes does that kind of analysis drive us to? Well, in the case of The Old Man and the Sea, for example, we might notice that the protagonist wants to succeed in a struggle against inhuman forces that are arrayed against him, that do not care to regard him as an individual with particular dreams and aspirations, but that just work against him by chance, and work against him because this is the way an impersonal universe behaves. And all of his talent, all of his experience, all of his greatness in terms of the strength of his hands amounts to little, if not nothing, in the face of this inhuman opposition of the universe. He catches the great fish, does the protagonist of The Old Man and the Sea, and yet it is eaten by sharks on his way home, so that he is finally defeated by circumstances, and yet manages to maintain a sort of dignity in the face of this defeat, a sort of grace under all this pressure that gives him a quasi-heroic cast by the time the story is over. We might ask the question, what underlying theme does this story tend to emphasize and suggest to us as readers? And we might conclude that it's something of a pessimistic one, that there is no eternal, extra-local significance to life, and that disaster waits around every corner, not because of a particular antagonism in the universe or a particular personal antagonist, but because that's the way it goes. The best that a protagonist can hope for, or indeed anyone in this life, is to exhibit the kind of calm, gracious acceptance of life as it comes that characterizes this story's protagonist. Now, having said nothing about the historical socioeconomic context of The Old Man and the Sea, we might conclude that that is a logical, fair reading of the story based on a structural analysis. If we were to look at the life and times of the story's author, Ernest Hemingway, and the 1950s in America, we might find evidence to support our conclusions about what the story is trying to say. We might look at Ernest Hemingway's difficult life, about his own journey away from organized religion, about the deep skepticism that he harbored toward the traditional categories of morality and right and wrong. We might look at his struggle with pain and suffering and the conclusions that it led him to. We might look at the history of the first half of the 20th century, the devastation wreaked in the American intellectual community by World War I and then even further by World War II, by the way that these disasters, these worldwide disasters, undercut and destabilized the philosophical and religious moorings that had made American intellectual life what it was in the 19th century. We might look around at other authors besides Hemingway and see the great effect that this destabilizing period had on their works and on their ideas. And we might see a general trend in American letters, and indeed in Western letters, away from the certainties of the 19th century and toward profound uncertainties in the early part of the 20th. And we might look and see that an author making these kind of statements in his work about the meaninglessness of life, about the forlorn hope for some sort of eternal significance, about having to settle for this idea of a certain dignity and a certain grace in the face of overwhelming opposition, in the face of meaninglessness, is the best you can hope for. We might see that that kind of conclusion seems pretty natural and pretty logical given the historical events that led up to and preceded the composition of The Old Man and the Sea. And so we're left with a couple of questions. Does The Old Man and the Sea's meaning and significance arise inevitably, or is it determined by its context? I think that might be too much to say, right? Can The Old Man and the Sea speak to the universal condition of man, regardless of the time and place in which it's read? Can we imagine a time 500 years from now? Can we imagine a time 1,000 years from now where a man might pick up The Old Man and the Sea and see this human struggle against a questionable universe And we might see this reader, that is to say, might see a protagonist concluding, well, the best you can do is kind of soldier on with a calmness about you and a certain dignity. And a reader 1,000 years from now might say, I get what you mean. That's probably as well as you can do. Or a reader might say, I see that without a framework of interpretation, maybe a religious commitment, maybe a belief in a God who oversees the world and has a plan for it, this might be the best conclusion you can come to. I can see an aspect of the human condition in that response, and it is applicable to me, though I live 1,000 years later. Of course we can. We can imagine that very well. In fact, that's kind of how we treat the Odyssey, right? That's how we treat the Iliad and the Aeneid and the ancient epics. That's how we treat the works of Shakespeare and Dante and even Dickens, who lived in times far removed from our own, with concerns far different from our own. And yet, in their work, we see an echo of universal human experience. And so, of course, there is some sort of significance to the work that transcends time and place. On the other hand, does it add to our understanding of the work to notice that it is the product of a writer from the first half of the 20th century, an American writer from the first half of the 20th century, who lived through the devastation of World War I, who was driven to skepticism and to a negative outlook, a nihilistic outlook on life by his experiences, and wrote The Old Man and the Sea as a fair embodiment, as a fair expression of his reaction to those experiences? I would say that it does. I would say that a student who knows that has a certain ability to understand Hemingway on his own terms, to understand The Old Man and the Sea on its own terms, that someone considering it without that context doesn't have, and that his understanding is enriched. And I'll say one more thing. He probably has the ability, the opportunity, I'll put it, for empathy with Ernest Hemingway's worldview, for empathy and identification with those who share Hemingway's worldview, that he might not have if he knew nothing about the historical circumstances which surrounded the writing of The Old Man and the Sea. So on the one hand, is The Old Man and the Sea a deterministic result of historical and economic forces that led Hemingway like an evolutionary automaton to write the novel? Could it have been written any other way, or is it absolutely determined by its circumstances? No, not at all. But on the other hand, is it completely separate from those circumstances? I say no. I say the best way to understand a work of literature is to interpret it as a work of art, as an object that stands before us on its own, to see what it has to say as a novel, to see what it has to say as a play, to see what it has to say as a poem, and apply our own understanding of those works of art and their structures and the way that they are put together and the way they operate and move. And then to check our work, so to speak, by an examination of and a consideration of the historical circumstances that swirled around the authors as those authors wrote, and see if an understanding and a sympathy with those historical circumstances can give us insight into the writing and composition and even the underlying universal themes of those works. So I would suggest a middle way between these two extremes. On the one hand, that context is everything, and that there's no really such thing as art, there's really just archaeology. I would suggest that that is one extreme we should avoid. On the other hand, I would also suggest avoiding the impulse to consider a work of art as completely detached from its time and place. I think walking between those two extremes can give us a good level-headed path, a level-headed approach to interpreting and understanding great literature. I hope this has been provocative. If you have any comments or questions, please respond in the chat below, and we will see you on another episode.